as you know, on Tuesday, Dr. Fauci went to the Hill and was given some tough questioning by Republican lawmakers as to why did he dismiss the lab leak theory at the get-go? What science was the 6 foot, distancing based on? What science was masking children based on? And he really didn't take any accountability. It seemed to be the CDC's fault. It seemed to be somebody under him's fault. He never took firm responsibility for exactly what happened in the missteps during the COVID-19 years. I'm sure that you watched the testimony. What were your thoughts on his answers and what seems to be a real lack of accountability for these government officials who made these crucial decisions that so impacted America?
Well, it just was a further demonstration of the gain of dysfunctionality in Washington, D.C. It's either a gain or a game, but it's a gain for those who practice it successfully, like Dr. Fauci, who's one part medical pioneer, one part snake oil salesman, and another part just pure out Washington deep state kleptocrat. Running a bureaucracy that's the largest in the whole U.S. government in terms of grant funding. They're putting out $4 or $5 billion a year. Biodefense is well over half of that. How did he become this biodefense guy and then do nothing with his biodefense billions he's put in? He's actually spent over $38.5 billion on biodefense since 2002, between 2002 and 2022, when he left the National Institutes of Health on so-called biodefense research. It didn't detect COVID. It didn't diagnose COVID. Didn't disrupt COVID. Instead, it became protecting that program became one of the reasons why he strove to assert himself and to cover up his fingerprints and those of his colleagues. And his colleagues include, members of his own inner sanctum, David Morins, who testified, who was his senior advisor. Fauci tried to downplay in the hearing his relationship with Morins. It goes back over, I think, 26 years. He's been the senior advisor. Morins had been the senior advisor to Fauci for, I think, 22 years. I was senior advisor to two secretaries of state. As far as I know, I was the only senior advisor. I actually used to call myself the junior advisor because secretary probably would make fun of me with my fancy title. But I was a senior advisor, and that meant I had direct access to communications involving the secretary. I was in consultation frequently with him and our deputy secretary, Rich Armitage, and then I continued under Connie Rice when I moved over to the counselor's office. But that's all part of the secretary's office, so I know what it's like to be in the inner sanctum of important people. And, that continued when I worked at the state under Secretary Pompeo and working in the intelligence world before that. I've never seen behavior like this in my life in Washington. It didn't just start at NIH and NIAID, Fauci's organization. We saw it in the State Department ourselves. We saw it with $100 million plus of USAID funding to Chinese government, which we had no idea for biological research and development. I mean, what is AID doing in this? We could never figure it out. I mean, the Pompeo, he didn't even know about it. I didn't know about it. I mean, and then state was clearing some of my own colleagues and some of the people that reported to Tom DiNanno, who was our assistant secretary, and myself. They kept complaining to us, don't investigate COVID-19 because it's gonna blow back right in our faces. I'm like, why are you saying that? And they said, we can't tell you. It's a Pandora's box. It's a can of worms. I mean, this thing goes beyond Dr. Fauci. It gets into China, the Chinese government, the ambitions of the People's Liberation Army to harness biology, especially synthetic biology, to create super viruses with specific effects ranging from causing severe illness, like we've seen with COVID getting into people's lungs, but reaching also into the neurological domain where COVID's had a much bigger impact than people have really figured out until recently. This was we know, because I was running the WMD intelligence function at state, which basically the whole government rolls up into that cone. So we're the policy arm of the weapons of mass destruction and countering that. But the intelligence people have to report to us because we compile annual reports on compliance with things like the Biological Weapons Convention. And that was the basis why I started the investigation in the summer of 2020, because we suspected there had been a number of biological weapons related convention violations. So I started investigating the Chinese, and I'd been looking into it since the onset of SARS-CoV-2, as we saw it in January of 2020. I'd been following the intel because it concerned my office and our mission of countering weapons of mass destruction and trying to control the technology flow related to that. But we weren't looking at the National Institutes of Health in our own government. But we soon started to suspect that the fix was in because, when we received sensitive intelligence briefings, we were getting the same talking points from the intelligence community that were coming straight out of Fauci and his scientific coterie, including the scientists that he brought in beginning of February 2020 to advise him on the nature of COVID-19. And these are the same scientists, of course, as the hearing covered, that had repeatedly warned in their initial analysis of the COVID sequence that it looked engineered. Mm-hmm. And then, miraculously 3 days later, with no paper trail documenting what changed their analysis, they changed their view. And then, of course, they all received multi-million-dollar NIAID grants in the wake of this. And Fauci says it's outrageous to suggest that there could be some connection. It's outrageous for us to deny that there's a connection. Okay, there's a connection. I've heard this from some of the scientists themselves, actually, believe it or not. They felt threatened if they didn't toe the line. And, he was careful to sort of mask his communications, but he had his staff, his minions, who made it clear that if you wanted to play and, you were going to have to pay up in the form of you wanted him to pay you, you had to play the game of trying to participate really in a COVID cover-up, which to me is about the most reprehensible thing I can imagine, because, we really weren't in a position to declare anything in February of 2020 regarding the origin of COVID-19. We knew it was coming from China. We knew the Chinese were covering it up at a level which you've never seen. And I've been covering China for 34 years, literally since I was in college and I had a security clearance doing work for the U.S. State Department. So, I mean, I went through SARS, so no one's going to tell me, since I was a senior advisor for East Asia and Pacific Affairs and one of the point people at State for SARS, largely because I was in Beijing covering that I was part of the North Korea six-party talks, but I was the senior official on duty basically and in Beijing when the thing became public in 2003 in January. And so I attended meetings with the Minister of Public Health in China. I attended meetings with the police. I attended lots of meetings with the Foreign Service of the Chinese government. They didn't hide the existence of SARS. They just told us, please don't tell anyone. We want to keep it a state secret. But they didn't hide it from the State Department. They didn't tell us everything they should have, but they didn't just deny its existence. This time they told us absolutely nothing, denied that it really even existed as a threat. And essentially, and then they allowed hundreds of thousands of people to leave China, while at the same time they shut down Wuhan and other cities in intra-Chinese travel. So, what was the Chinese agenda? We certainly considered it hostile from day one that we started in covering the COVID cover-up in Wuhan and in Beijing. But, little did we realize the extent to which it was going on inside our own government. And that's what came out of that hearing yesterday, or at least should have come out in the